From 1878 to 1968, there were 71 lake captains that called Bayview, Wisconsin, on the shore of Lake Michigan, their home. While they lived here, they captained 195 different ships, from tugboats to schooners to steamships, in voyages that took them to every one of the Great Lakes. Join us now for another episode of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we explore not only these captains, but also their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we talk about the 71 different lake captains that once lived in Bayview from 1878 to 1968 in the age of sail and steam. This episode, like the others, is sponsored and presented by the Historic Bayview Lake Captains Society. Now, before I stepped into the camera here, you saw two houses across the street. Probably see this one better over here and then this one better over here. Okay, from where I'm standing now. The one on the right here is actually lived in that house at the time of the story. His name was Captain John Leisk. And this house over here, for 5 years, was owned and lived in by Captain James Leisk, his brother. Although at the time of the story, James had just left a couple years earlier to move in with his brother Henry in Milwaukee. Now, this is a sailing adventure. It's a good one. You'll like it. And it involves James Leisk towing John Leisk on their way to Buffalo with a load of oats. A storm picks up, and with James in the lead towing John, they make a beeline for Buffalo to try to make it there before the storm gets too bad. And I will leave it at that because that's the rest of the story. It's a great story. You may remember that James Leisk, out of all the 71 captains in Bayview, is my personal favorite because he epitomizes everything you could ever possibly want from the tradition of going to sea. They're both from Scotland. They both sailed in Scotland before coming here. James was a seaman on clipper ships to Hong Kong and back to England. Phenomenal. I'll put the links to both of them that I've done previously to include their complete biographies in the description box, and I'll also put their brother Thomas Leisk's link to his biography on an episode I did previously, also down there. Thomas, I mean, amazing, was an Arctic Ocean whaler before he came to Bayview while they lived in Scotland. Just phenomenal. But this story is also great. So with that, I'll say goodbye for now. Hats off to our Bayview Lake captains, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Welcome to another installment of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we discuss the lives of the 71 different lake captains that once lived in Bayview, Wisconsin, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the age of sail and steam. This discussion will include their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes. Here is the map of lake captains' homes in Bayview to show you where this episode takes place. Its location focuses primarily on the large green arrow. Today we will be providing the true story of a sailing adventure experienced by two Bayview lake captains, James and John Leisk, both brothers and immigrants from Scotland. James and John had lived right next door to each other in Bayview on South Burrell Street, 2451 and 2455 respectively, for 3 years, from 1888 to 1891, while both were serving as Bayview lake captains. Links to their complete biographies, already published on this channel, can be found in the description box. At the time of this story, 1893, James had just departed Bayview the year before, though he was still captain of the same ship, the steamship Helena, he had captained while in Bayview. John still lived at 2455 South Burrell Street, and, like brother James, also was captaining the same ship, the schooner barge Amboy, he was when James lived next door. This adventure occurred when they were sailing the same route together in two different ships, the steamship Helena, captained by James, towing the schooner barge Amboy, captained by John. In this sailing arrangement, the ship being towed, the Amboy, was referred to as a consort in the Great Lakes maritime trade. During the daylight hours on 15th October 1893, while most of the way across Lake Erie and nearing their destination port of Buffalo, New York, both men observed a huge nor'easter storm approaching. James and John realized they now had to sail as fast as they could in order to get safely into port at Buffalo before the storm hit. They were literally racing the storm. Would they make it? Stay with us now as we detail what happened. In order to best tell this story, fictitious conversations are provided. However, these do not affect the factualness of the story. It is from the book Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, which also contains all the sources for this episode. We will now begin. It was 5th October 1893, and the autumn weather was only now approaching. This crisp, cool, sunny morning found Captain James Leisk and his brother, Captain John Leisk, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, preparing for their next voyage. They had just learned that their ships, the steamship Helena and the schooner barge Amboy, respectively, had received a contract through the Milwaukee Grain Exchange to carry a cargo of oats from Milwaukee to Buffalo, New York. Fall was always a busy time at Milwaukee's port, because grains of all sorts had just been harvested from Wisconsin's vast farmland, and now had to quickly be taken to market before expiring. Likewise, coal that was mined in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and other eastern states was now being sought after by homes and businesses in the Great Lakes, which included Wisconsin and its chief port of Milwaukee. Coal was the primary heating source needed to make it through the notoriously cold winters of the upper Midwest. Once mined, the coal was transported to Buffalo by rail and then put aboard ships to reach ports like Milwaukee in the western Great Lakes. Rail infrastructure was still advancing, but at the time of this story, the best way to get the coal back to Milwaukee from Buffalo was still by ship. Therefore, by far the most usual cargo being carried on the lakes in the fall months was grain and other similar farm products, going east to Buffalo, and then coal coming back. This was the contract that James and John Leisk had been hired to carry on their ships, Helena and Amboy. Specifically, the cargo going out was oats, 110,000 bushels of it for the Amboy. The cargo carried by the Helena is not reported. However, it is highly likely it was oats, grain, wheat, or something similar. James Leisk had set a Great Lakes record a few years earlier, in August 1888, as captain of the Helena on its maiden voyage, when it carried the largest grain cargo ever on a wooden-hulled ship in the Great Lakes from Milwaukee to Buffalo. On its return trip back to Milwaukee, it set another record when it carried the largest cargo of coal ever carried on the lakes by a wooden-hulled ship. He lived at 2451 South Burrell Street at the time, right next to his brother John, who was also a Bayview Lake captain, though John's ship at that time is unknown. The total duration of this voyage over to Buffalo would take the two brothers between 8 to 10 days, depending on the wind and weather. They'd both sailed this route before, separately, in previous years, but this 1893 sailing season was the first time they'd sailed together under the consort arrangement, where James would be towing John. Brother towing brother. They decided to go to a coffee shop in Walker's Point, closest to where their ships were docked, to discuss it. "Congratulations, John," said James Leisk as he greeted his brother. "Same to you, James," replied John. "It's always good to get a contract." Then, as John took a sip of his coffee, he pulled a shipping order out of his pocket. "We are to load the oats at Grain Elevator A tomorrow morning," announced John. "Oh, that'll take 2 days, so we should be underway the morning of the 7th, replied James. "Agreed. Can you take care of getting the tugs?" asked John. "Yes," said James, "and since I'll be at the harbour-master's office anyway to set that up, I'll also get you some handlers to help cast off the lines." "OK," said John. "If we set sail at 8 a.m., we should make Buffalo during daylight on the 15th. All right with you?" "Agreed. 8 a.m. on the 7th, said James. "Pity it's not still July. Now that it's fall, the weather will be a roll of the dice. Come aboard the Helena 30 minutes before sailing, and we'll go over the final details before getting underway." The two brothers then finished their coffee and left for their respective ships to prepare for the cargo loading and upcoming voyage. Sailing day, 7th of October, 1893, arrived. The good weather continued, as this day was also sunny, though remaining cool. After loading up their cargoes from the grain elevators in the port of Milwaukee the day before, the harbour-master arranged for both ships to be tied up, fore and aft of each other, on the same pier, in order to help with their joint departure. The Helena was closest to the port exit, its bow facing it, with the bow of the Amboy, which was to be towed by the Helena, right behind the Helena's stern. As arranged, John Leisk arrived at the brow, or stairs, of the Helena, right at 7:30 a.m. Brother James was standing on deck to welcome him aboard. "Greetings, John," said James, as the two brothers shook hands when John boarded the Helena. "Come on into my quarters." James Leisk, as captain of the Helena, had beautiful living quarters, as would be expected for a lake captain of the time, for this type of ship. The Helena was very large, and still relatively new, having been launched just 5 years earlier, in July 1888. His brother John had, of course, been aboard and seen these quarters before, but still their spacious beauty earned his admiration. "Your quarters are truly something to behold," remarked John to his brother. James acknowledged his brother's compliment with a nod and a smile. Captain of it on its maiden voyage, and still its captain today, James Leisk's quarters aboard Helena consisted of a private cabin, as well as an outer office. The interior of both were described in news reports as being, quote, "finished in antique oak," unquote, and also having, quote, "a parlour, bathroom, washroom, and closet in red oak," unquote. While no photos of Captain Leisk's quarters aboard the Helena are known to exist, here is a photo of the interior of a Great Lakes ship captain's cabin from a different but similar ship of the same time frame, in order to provide an idea of what Captain Leisk's cabin might have looked like. Getting to this point in life had been a long journey for James Leisk. Before immigrating to the USA, he'd crewed the famous clipper ships as a teenager, carrying tea from Hong Kong, Macau, and other ports in the Far East, back to London and Southampton. He'd paid his dues as a sailor by climbing their huge masts during storms to furl and unfurl the sails, among other strenuous and dangerous duties. Then he came to America and Bayview, and was now captain of one of the lake's most famous ships. As previously mentioned, he'd already set 2 records on the Helena's maiden voyage, on this very route between Milwaukee and Buffalo, the largest grain and coal cargoes in Great Lakes history for a wooden-hulled ship. His brother John Leisk wasn't a rookie either. Although his background in Scotland prior to coming to America and Bayview is unknown, his subsequent involvement in the Bayview maritime scene as a lake captain matches that of his 3 other brothers, who were all either Bayview or Milwaukee lake captains, suggesting he too grew up as a professional sailor in Scotland. After he arrived in Milwaukee and Bayview, he'd captained schooners as far back as 1880, and even owned and captained the 3-masted schooner Narragansett. Now he was captaining the 3-masted schooner barge Amboy. By coincidence, the Amboy was constructed as a schooner barge in 1874 with the original name of Helena. However, this was a completely different ship than the steamship Helena his brother James was captaining in this story. That was built in 1888. Both brothers, James and John Leisk, had lived next to each other in Bayview for 3 years, at 2451 and 2455 South Burrell Street, respectively, while they were lake captains. At the time of this story, James had just left Bayview in 1892 to live with one of his other brothers, Henry, another lake captain, though not in Bayview, in Wauwatosa. Like James, Henry had towed another Leisk brother and Bayview lake captain, Thomas, as a consort in 1899, under a 1-year contract with the Illinois Steel Company, the new owners of the Bayview rolling mill, hauling cargo around the lakes to and from the mill. James had also had a prior contract with the rolling mill in 1878, as either captain or mate of the schooner Red, White and Blue, to deliver cargoes of old rails. The Leisk brothers, all of whom immigrated from Scotland, were something special. Prior dedicated episodes on this channel have appeared about James, Thomas, and John Leisk, and also one about the aforementioned Bayview rolling mill cargo contracts, so be sure to check the description box for these links. The sailing arrangements for this particular voyage in October 1893 featured James Leisk in his much larger steamship Helena, towing brother John behind him in the schooner barge Amboy. This was not an unusual arrangement for shipping cargo at the time. In fact, it was very common, and there were good reasons for it. Schooner barges were different from schooners. Schooner barges were built primarily as barges, with masts and sails added only for minimal or emergency manoeuvring. Schooners, by contrast, were built specifically as sailing ships with extensive manoeuvring capability. Many times schooner barges were converted from older vessels. Some of them were also built specifically for the consort role, as the amboy was. Schooner barge hulls were also generally built wider to carry more cargo, rendering them not nearly as sleek as that of a pure schooner. Consorts were basically schooner barges that were towed by steamships. The thought was that if one or more of these consorts could be towed behind one steamship, the number of crewmen on the schooner barges could be greatly reduced compared to a normal schooner. That would save a great deal of money, the main cost of each voyage. Other savings came from the simplicity of its design. Since the goal was minimal manoeuvring ability, the masts and sails were limited and simpler, requiring less construction and maintenance costs. Just enough to turn the ship, but not so much to make it turn on a dime. Speed, a feature of schooners who often raced each other on the lakes, wasn't needed for bulkier schooner barges that were slowly towed behind steamers. In the competition among shipping companies of the day to secure cargo contracts, the ability to carry more cargo at a lower cost provided an advantage over single ships. Steamers could, and often did, tow more than one consort vessel behind it, that resulted in more cargo arriving at the same time. In cases where more than one consort was towed behind a single steamship, cargo volume transported in a single voyage could even be tripled or quadrupled. This photograph shows this multiple consort arrangement in operation. Of course, there were trade-offs, and these were not insignificant. The two main problems were, first, that tow lines can break, especially in bad weather. Secondly, if the tow line breaks, or if, for other reasons, a consort has to be cast off from the towing vessel and released, the limited manoeuvring capability of schooner barges made them a dangerous proposition in bad weather. Turns couldn't be made quickly or efficiently. They only had sail power, and the canvas was greatly reduced from a normal schooner. Each schooner barge had a skeleton crew aboard for such situations, but they could only do so much with the reduced capability for steering. And so this was the situation and dangers that James and John Leisk faced as they planned their departure for Buffalo. James, as captain of the much larger steamship Helena, would be towing John in the schooner barge Amboy. Both men were very aware of their respective duties and roles in this week-long voyage across 3 of the 5 Great Lakes. They had very likely already been doing it during this sailing season of 1893. Many examples are found of steamships being assigned specific consorts for an entire sailing season, sometimes more. Their brothers Henry and Thomas Leisk were examples of this, where Henry exclusively towed Thomas as a consort for several years. Nevertheless, this towing, consort, sailing arrangement was still an important item to be discussed as James and John Leisk sat together in James's cabin on the Helena this mid-October morning for a pre-departure coffee. "Well, let's go over it," said James. "There's a slight southwest wind now, which will be perfect for departure. We'll attach the tow line first, then cast off lines from the pier simultaneously. The harbour master will have his people ready to do that 30 minutes from now, at 8 o'clock as planned. Once we leave the pier, I'll put the engine ahead slow until the line gets taut, and then proceed at around 3 knots until we exit the harbour. If the weather gets bad in a few days en route, I'll post a watch at the stern of the Helena to keep an eye on the tow line. If we need to manoeuvre, we can communicate via our megaphones." "Agreed," replied John. "And if we have to cut the line on our end, I'll holler to you beforehand, and you do the same to me if you have to cut it on your end." "Okay," answered James. Hopefully that won't happen, but we'll be ready if it does. The barometer this morning is a strong high, so if this good weather can last another week, it'll be easy." "Yeah, if," said John. And with that, John Leisk departed, and walked down the pier to his own ship, the Amboy, that was immediately astern of the Helena. The weather was the key in all of this. High pressure on a barometer indicates good weather. But in those days there was no weather forecasting to speak of, no satellites to provide tracking of weather systems from above, nor other similar modern technologies that give advance warning of approaching storms. Radio wasn't even invented yet, so there was no way for ships underway on the lakes to receive weather information from ashore, or even communicate to each other ship to ship via radio telephone like we can today. Weather radar was also non-existent, since radar itself wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. In 1893, the time of this story, captains only had their barometers, but these merely registered changes in barometric pressure a short time before weather changed. Captains back in the 1890s mostly relied on their ability to spot subtle changes in wind direction and cloud formations to try to get an idea of an approaching storm. Experience could help a lot in picking up clues in the wind and clouds, something both Leisk brothers had a lot of. But the truth was that more often than not this was guesswork, and ships on the Great Lakes in these early days were completely at the mercy of the weather. Nobody knew that better than Captains James and John Leisk. Right on schedule, at 8 a.m., the tow line from the Helena to the Amboy was successfully attached, and then the fore and aft lines of each ship were cast off from the pier by the harbour-master's men. James Leisk on the Helena ordered his engine ahead slow, and, as the tow line tightened, began to pull the Amboy behind it. John Leisk on the Amboy ordered his sails raised by his small crew to allow him to take advantage of the slight breeze from the southwest, so he could manoeuvre in the channel behind the Helena as needed. Soon both ships made it to the harbour exit and sailed out together into Lake Michigan. The beautiful morning meant calm seas, and after sailing eastward out into the lake, to distance themselves a bit from the coastline, James Leisk hollered through his megaphone to brother John behind him on the Amboy.
"Okay, John," hollered James to his brother. "In 1 minute, we'll turn to port and head due north." "We're ready for the turn,"
John on the Amboy shouted back via his megaphone. When the time came, James Leisk commanded the helmsman aboard the Helena to turn to port and take up a compass heading of 360 degrees. Brother John Leisk had his own helmsman on the Amboy prepared, and when 1 minute was reached, he waited to watch the rudder on the Helena in front of him turn to port. As it did so, John gave the order to turn port to 360 degrees, and thus the Amboy smoothly turned with the Helena, keeping the tow line taut and directly aligned. The Leisks made it look easy. This process was repeated for other turns over the next few days, as the two ships travelled together, first on Lake Michigan, then Lake Huron, then down the Detroit River, and finally into Lake Erie. Each time, James Leisk hollered his course changes through the megaphone to his brother behind him on the Amboy. The weather remained perfect, and it was literally smooth sailing, as the two brothers matched turns and rudder headings. As they got 3/4 of the way across Lake Erie, with their destination port of Buffalo only a half-day sailing time ahead of them, both men remarked to each other that early morning how the beautiful weather was still with them.
"Can you believe we've still got this clear weather?"
shouted James through his megaphone, from the stern of the Helena to brother John behind and below him on the bridge wing of the smaller Amboy.
"I know, it's amazing,"
John hollered back through his own megaphone.
"A beautiful voyage, just 8 more hours to go."
Both men then waved at each other, congratulating themselves on their good fortune. But they'd spoken too soon. Just a few hours later, as they could start to see through their spyglasses the outline of the Buffalo coast in front of them, the sun began to disappear through clouds. 30 minutes after that, dark storm clouds formed to the northeast. James got his megaphone out to holler instructions to his brother.
"John, I'm going to increase the flank speed so we can beat the storm to port,"
yelled James. He'd been running the engine on the Helena at a head standard most of this voyage to save wear and tear on it, and also to keep the coal usage down. Going ahead standard instead of ahead full saved lots of coal, which kept costs down. This delayed them a little, but economically it was worth it. However, now the situation had changed due to the weather. The issue now wasn't to conserve coal. It was to race the storm to port for safety, maybe even saving lives in the process, including possibly even his brother John being towed behind him.
"Understood,"
yelled back John. Then James went back into Helena's pilot house and rang the engine telegraph to ahead flank, and the engine room responded. James then hollered down to his engineer, through the brass speaking tube, the reason for the change. "Robert, there's a big storm coming from the northeast. Buffalo is in sight, but we've got to make port before the gale hits us, so I am going to flank speed." "Aye, Captain," replied the engineer from the other end of the speaking tube, down in the engine room. "The coalers," the men shoveling coal into the boilers, "have all got their backs into it now." The Helena creaked and groaned as the revolutions on the ship's propeller rapidly increased. James muttered to himself, "Come on," as he wished the Helena to speed along faster. But the only thing anyone could really do now was watch and wait. The crusty old bearded keeper of the U.S. Life-Saving Service's Buffalo station hadn't been sitting idly by either. Alerted to the approaching storm by his lookouts at the station, the keeper ordered his men, called surfmen, to prepare the station's rescue boat, and also to make ready the breech's buoy. If a ship became stranded too far out to be reached by the breech's buoy, a pulley system used to winch sailors safely ashore, then the rescue boat would be rowed out into the surf to reach the ship and effect the rescue that way. These rescuers routinely risked their lives to help stranded sailors in danger. The surfman's motto was legendary: "You have to go out. You don't have to come back." Now the wind really began to kick in, approaching 40 miles per hour. Because the Helena had a steam propulsion system turning a propeller, it could navigate its own way through the northeast wind into the port at Buffalo. But not its consort, the Amboy. As previously discussed, the Amboy's reduced sails were provided as a limited means of independent manoeuvring, not fully fledged tacking into the wind like that of a schooner. Even in this wind, a schooner would find it tough going, since this wind was right in their faces. After another 15 minutes, just as the Buffalo port came into view, the rain began. And it wasn't a light rain either. It was coming down in sheets. They were sailing directly east, but the wind and storm was coming from the northeast. John Leisk on the Amboy had ordered his skeleton crew to hoist the sails, and was already at 3/4 port rudder, just trying to compensate for the northeast wind. He knew if it increased any more, there was no way he could keep up, and the wind would push him south and away from the Helena, snapping the tow line in the process. James Leisk inside the pilot house of the Helena saw the approaching danger too, and, throwing on foul-weather oilskins and hat while grabbing the megaphone, he left the pilot house to go outside into the weather, and proceeded to struggle to the stern.
"John,
hollered James Leisk.
"If the wind increases any more, we're going to have to release the line. I'll tow you right up to the harbour entrance and then turn hard a port to try to slingshot you in. Right after I make the turn, release your line and make for it." "Aye, James,"
replied Brother John.
"That's a good plan. We'll be ready."
James was in a tough spot. Sure, he could maintain course straight into the harbour, but not at this speed, or he'd wreck himself once inside, because he wouldn't be able to slow down. Stopping a ship weighing thousands of tons is akin to trying to stop a freight train. It takes a long time, and the faster it's going, the longer it takes to stop. No, he'd have to slow down before entering, and when he did, the Amboy would be blown southeast into the breakwater. That's why James decided on the slingshot manoeuvre. He'd keep flank speed up as close as he could get to the entrance, and at the last minute, before reaching it, turn hard a port, and simultaneously release the line. That way, the Amboy could keep its speed up from the tow line right up to the very last minute. Then, because they had a propeller, James and the Helena would circle back behind the Amboy and enter the harbour that way. The only question now was if the wind would hold at 40, or if it would increase further. It was a roll of the dice. The entrance to Buffalo Harbour was only 3 miles now. Both brothers prayed for the wind to hold. 3 miles became 2, then 1. The Amboy was now using full left rudder just to maintain course behind the Helena. But, as John breathlessly waited for his brother on the Helena to make that hard port turn to the left into the teeth of the northeast gale, to slingshot him and the Amboy towards the harbour entrance, the wind exploded in force. It reached 60 knots in a matter of seconds. James now knew the slingshot idea wouldn't work in this gale, because the tow line couldn't take the stress. He hoisted the megaphone and yelled for his brother. "Release the line, John! We're not going to make it to the turn in time!" John could barely hear him through the wind and rain. But before John could even reply, just as he was about to give the order to his crew to release the tow line, the worst happened. The tow line snapped. The word tow line doesn't really convey to those who have never been to sea what that really means or is. Line is actually rope, and the size of a rope used to tow another ship is the largest to be found. In this story, the tow line was easily 5 or 6 inches in diameter. When a rope of that size breaks from force, it sounds like a cannon going off. Worse, any man caught in its path when it snaps and goes flying will be cut in half. So when the tow line connecting the Amboy to the Helena broke, the cannon shot sound it made could be heard not just through the wind and rain of the huge gale, it could also be heard by those ashore. Kaboom! The line snapped. As soon as it broke, the Amboy began to be blown southeast and away from the Helena. Captain James Leisk on the Helena could only watch as the ship carrying his brother blew off to the shore and the rocks of the breakwater. Captain John Leisk on the Amboy had little time to act. The harbour entrance was just ahead to his left now, but he was being blown to the south of the entrance by the northeast gale-force wind, towards a breakwater that extended back to the shore. This breakwater was protected by many, many huge rocks and boulders. The rudder was hard over to make the ship turn left or to port, and he kept the sails up to hope for some forward speed to have any chance of reaching the harbour. But he was sailing straight into the wind. Tacking was impossible in a schooner barge. It was no use. John Leisk and his crew on the Amboy were now really just along for the ride. With his naked eye, John could see the rocks of the breakwater forming the south side of the harbour entrance approaching. The Amboy was going to smash right into them.
"Brace for impact!"
yelled John Leisk to his crew.
"Ready the survival gear!"
Just 5 minutes later, the schooner barge Amboy, carrying its 110,000 bushels of oats, slammed into the rocks. Fortunately for the Amboy, the entire event was being observed by the lookouts at the Buffalo life-saving station. When they heard that cannon-like report when the tow line snapped, everybody knew a rescue would be needed. Because of the previous planning by the station's keeper when the wind picked up, the station's crew was ready. They could all see the Amboy when it slammed onto the rocks of the southern breakwater. The sickening crashing sound the wooden ship made as it impacted the rocks was a sound all lake captains and sailors dreaded. "Launch the breech's buoy!" yelled the station's keeper, who by this time was standing on the station's observation platform and watching everything through his spyglass. The horses hauling the buoy were already hooked up, and away they and the crew all went into the howling wind and pouring rain. He'd just last month appointed a young 21-year-old to lead this crew, and this was to be the young man's first test. 21 may seem young today, but in 1893 men's life expectancy was only 43. This forced them to have to grow up fast. It only took minutes for the breech's buoy, horses and wagon to reach the Amboy, since by pure luck this particular stretch of the breakwater had a path of land going its entire length from the shore straight out to the end of it at the harbour entrance. Huge rocks and boulders went along on each side of it for protection from the water, as well as at the end of it where it met the lake. It was these rocks at the end that the Amboy had hit and was now stranded upon. It should be noted here that available news reporting on the accident doesn't report the exact method of rescue for this event. However, given the specifics of the Amboy's wreck location right at the end of the breakwater at the port of Buffalo, as well as the Amboy's crew reported in the news as being, quote, taken off the wreck, unquote, by U.S. lifesavers of the Buffalo station, it's highly likely that the breech's buoy was indeed the rescue method used. Trying to effect a rescue by boat in that smashing, raging surf in those 60-mile-an-hour winds was impossible. By contrast, the breech's buoy launch equipment could get right up in front of the wreck from the safety of the breakwater. The Amboy looked like a beached whale carcass. Up out of the water at an angle, with its bow or front up in the air on the rocks, the young, new breech's buoy team leader hollered to the Amboy, its name visible on the bow. "Ahoy, Amboy!" yelled the leader. "We're here to help you." John Leisk was amazed how fast they'd arrived, and even arrived at all. He looked over the starboard and port rails, and saw that the huge sea was crashing into the rocks below. They were a good 50 to 100 feet from the safety of the pathway holding the breech's buoy equipment. Even though they were so close to the breakwater's edge, there was no way they could reach it on their own over the rocks. If they tried to go over the ship's side and crawl up over the rocks on their own, the gigantic smashing surf would either pull them back into the water to be drowned or slam them against the rocks to fatally injure them. The breech's buoy was the only way to safety. John Leisk had to act fast. The ship was rapidly filling with water, and it was entirely possible that once it was completely filled, the waves and current would pull it back off the rocks into the lake, where it would sink. This is what would happen 7 years later with the three-masted schooner Narragansett that John owned. It ran up on the rocks of a remote Canadian island during a storm in northern Lake Huron, and then slid off back into Lake Huron and submerged. Bayview neighbour Captain John Broch, the captain he'd hired to sail the Narragansett for him, that sailing season of 1900, failed to make it off in time and was drowned. For John Leisk on the Amboy, the U.S. lifesavers were here now. The time to act was now.
"Ahoy, lifesavers! We're ready to accept the buoy!" hollered John Leisk through the raging storm, through his megaphone. "Stand by for the shot line!" shouted back the life-saving team leader. Then, bang, went the small cannon used to fire the shot line out to the ship. "Good boy!" the crusty old U.S. life-saving station keeper yelled from his perch on the observation deck of the station, as he watched through his spyglass as the shot line from the rescue team made it over to the Amboy. Though the ship wasn't that far off the breakwater edge, and the breech's buoy was only about 100 feet away from it, aiming a shot of any kind in these huge gale-force winds was a real challenge. A miss would cause a huge delay, because the shot line would have to be reeled back in, laid out on the ground properly, and the cannon reloaded before another shot could be taken. Lost time could mean lost lives. "The kid got it on the first try," he remarked to his assistant, watching with him. "I knew he could do it." "Remarkable," replied the assistant station keeper. The Amboy's crew affixed it to their forward mast, high enough up to make a clean, unobstructed route above the ship and to the shore. "You can send the buoy over," hollered John Leisk through the megaphone.
The lifesavers ashore then attached the breech's buoy to the line and began to winch it out to the stranded Amboy. Once it got there, Captain Leisk ordered the youngest and junior sailors to go off first. One by one, the Amboy's crew got into the buoy and were winched off the ship above the crashing surf below onto the safety of the shore. The empty buoy was then winched back out to the ship. Another sailor got in and was hauled ashore by the lifesavers, the process repeating itself until all the Amboy's crew was safely off, except its captain, John Leisk. After he went back to his sea cabin to grab all the ship's important papers and the ship's cash box, he then went back out on deck, got into the buoy, and was pulled ashore. As he hung in the buoy above the massive and violent waves, in this 60-mile-per-hour gale, he could see his crew standing around the lifesavers, watching him arrive. When he got there, the first person he spoke to was the life-saving team leader. "Thank you for saving our lives," John Leisk said to the leader, shaking hands. "You're very welcome. We do this all the time, so it is almost routine for us. We're happy everyone made it." The youngster didn't mention this was his first time running the team. And with that, John Leisk and his crew helped the surfmen pack up the breech's buoy contraption, load it onto the horse-drawn wagon, and then they all walked behind the horses through the still driving wind and rain back to the life-saving station, a 15-minute trip. Once there, the old station-keeper had blankets, hot coffee, and especially a shot of brandy waiting for them. Having liquor of any kind at the station was strictly and blatantly against the rules. But the old veteran life-saving keeper didn't care. At his age? Bah! He always kept a bottle he'd bought himself, hidden behind books in a wall case in his private quarters, for a moment just like this. 8 men's lives had just been saved, thanks to the brilliant work of his new young breeches buoy team leader and his surfmen. Bother the rules. Brandy is what everyone, including not only Captain John Leisk and his crew, but also the entire breeches team, needed. And it was brandy they would all get. After this much-needed and much-appreciated stiff shot, John Leisk and his men proceeded to rest for a few hours in makeshift cots set up at the life-saving station. Then, as the time approached 6 p.m., the same horse and wagon that had pulled the breeches buoy out to the end of the breakwater to rescue them now took them to a hotel in town. John Leisk had enough money in the ship's cash box to cover all of their lodging and meals for the next couple weeks. The next morning appeared in brilliant sunshine, and just a few clouds. Yesterday's storm turned out to be the worst recorded on the Great Lakes in 10 years. Many ships in Lake Erie had been lost. John Leisk headed back into the port to take a look at the Amboy and figure out a way forward. But would it even still be there, or did the huge waves finally overcome it and drag it back out into the lake to sink it? He dreaded the thought, and anxiously found his way to the breakwater. His concerns were unfounded. Fortunately, the Amboy survived the night and had remained stuck on the rocks. Now, in the good weather, it could be patched up enough to allow it to get pulled off the rocks by Buffalo's tugboats and towed into the harbour, where it could undergo repairs in one of Buffalo's shipyards. Surprisingly, the damage wasn't all that serious. By a miracle, the rocks had only smashed a few holes into the hull that could be quickly patched. The ship was insured, and the company's home office was in New York City. That afternoon, the claims adjuster took the train up to Buffalo. After inspecting the ship and talking to the life-saving station keeper and his crew, the adjuster approved the cost for the repairs. Sadly, while the Amboy survived to sail again, the cargo it was carrying, those 110,000 bushels of oats, was a complete loss. Even though the damage to the hull had been relatively limited, the damage inflicted by the rocks was still enough to flood the cargo hold with water. The total financial loss of the cargo was $40,000, or $1.1 million in 2017 dollars. Fortunately, the ship's insurance covered that too. John Leisk and his crew remained in Buffalo for 2 weeks, the estimated time for the repairs. There was no sense in sending them back to Milwaukee if the ship was going to sail again so soon. As estimated by the shipyard, the repairs were indeed completed in 2 weeks, and on 31st October 1893, the Amboy left port. It's highly likely, though unknown, it was loaded up with coal, as had been originally planned for the return voyage to Milwaukee, and again used as a consort. Given this was the chief cargo run for this time of year for ships in Milwaukee, carrying grain to Buffalo and returning with coal, it's entirely possible, if not probable, though unknown, given the short 2-week repair period for the Amboy in Buffalo, that John Leisk's brother James Leisk sailed back in the Helena to get him, towing John and the Amboy, with its coal load, safely back to Milwaukee. Thanks for watching. This photograph isn't about Bayview or its lake captains, but it's from the same era of Great Lakes maritime history. We thought we'd close with it for enjoyment, as it captures the spirit of the era. If you'd like to read more details about the Leisk brothers, or the sailing adventures of other Bayview lake captains, as well as the sources for the information contained in today's video, you can find these and more in the book Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, for sale now by individual volumes on both Amazon.com and HenschelHouseBooks.com. All proceeds from book sales go to support various maritime history projects related to Bayview's lake captains. One of these is a plaque and marker with the captains' names and addresses on it, as part of the creation of the Bayview Lake Captains Historic District, which will be the first of its kind in America. If you would like to contribute to support these projects, to include this and other markers honouring Bayview's lake captains, with 100% of all donations and contributions in all forms going to support them, please consider contributing to us through the listings found on our website under the Contribute button, as well as in the end credits at the conclusion of this video. Note, we are not a 501c3, so contributions are not tax-deductible. If, for some reason, we are unable to secure these markers, Then all funds donated to this site will be given as a cash donation to the museum ship SS City of Milwaukee in Manistee, Michigan. This is the only surviving intact ship that was once captained by a Bayview Lake captain, and in its case was captained by at least 2, and likely 3, totaling over 20 years between them. Finally, we also have free self-guided walking tours of Bayview's 71 lake captains' homes, using only your phone. It's simple and easy. Just go to our website shown here, find the item on the menu bar at the upper left named Free Self-Guided Walking Tours, and then scroll down to find the map with the instructions. Zoom in by street. When you find a captain's house you're interested in, click on it and details appear on the right, along with a link to the YouTube episode from this channel that provides the biography of the captain that lived there. It's free, fun, and available any time you're out walking. Just bring along your phone. I'm Simon Stanhope, narrator for these episodes. Join us again soon for the next chapter of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains.